returned in first grade, but the complication is that the same bus has to run a double run, and these kindergarten, these are 5 and 6-year-olds that are sitting on buses for 45 minutes. It also relies on teachers, the kindergarten teachers at the Hood, because these kindergartners are getting there early, to volunteer to come out and greet the kids half an hour early when they come in, because they come in on a different bus than the other Hood School students. That's a situation that has to be remedied going forward, and we'll talk about what that's going to imply. We talked about the spot redistricting. Also, the special ed programs were all moved into the little school and out of what was in the batch as well. So there have been negative impacts. So the assessment basically says that we need 3 additional classrooms over the next 3 years, and the space doesn't exist. So then the question was, how are we going to think about approaching the problem, given that, firstly, there's a lot of moving parts between these different schools, but also there's 2 open issues. As Mrs. Colella mentioned, there are really two dimensions of uncertainty here. The first is that the 2 Batchelder modulars may not be able to stay after next year, and therefore if in the situation that they can't stay, we would need to plan for a contingency. The other dimension is that although funding will be requested at town meeting and then at potentially an override vote, that may not be approved. And so what we wanted to do was look at what the situation would have to be under all those scenarios. So on slide 6, that sort of gets us to this 2x2 matrix, which basically says, what's the best case solution under each of these scenarios. And slide 7, basically gives a summary of what all the options are, and we'll talk about all of those in detail. But option 1 is in essence the status quo, which is maintain the current school organization and just continue to do that. And we'll talk in a second about what that's going to take from a space requirement and a cost requirement. That is we'll talk about is the most benign scenario, and that again assumes that the Batchelder modulars stay.
So you mean status quo simply from a redistricting perspective?
From
a
school organization and a school structure standpoint. Therefore, the status quo would mean that the Batchelder kindergartners would still continue to be taught at the Hood every year. And special ed would continue to be at the middle school.
So, but then, all right, I'll wait till we get there.
Yeah, okay, good. And the question then is, what do the other scenarios look like? And the important takeaway for this group, since really the decision on the bottom axis relies upon you, is what's this bottom right going to look like, and what's the implication, what's the cost? And what we want to do is just highlight that for you. Before I go on, I just want to, you asked the question about, does this include every option? In the bottom left column, we actually had several other options of, what could we do if we kept the modulars at the batch and had funding? Are there other creative ways to reorganize to help maybe improve some of the disadvantages that we have today, bring the kindergartners back and so forth? And we looked at several of those options. They were all very expensive and extraordinarily complicated to make happen. And so the school committee threw those out a couple weeks ago upon our recommendation. And so what we have there is one option 1. So let's go on and just talk about what they would mean. Before we do that, just slide 8 is our evaluation criteria. These are the things that are important. Firstly, cost and complexity. Secondly, preserving education quality. And then thirdly, minimizing the impact to communities and families. The things that are in the boxes, represent the most critical criteria. In effect, the things that are as close to deal breakers as anything out there. And as you can see, one of the elements there is seek approval by the HDC, because that's certainly part of the community impact. So let's move forward to slide 9, and then the details on the options. I hinted at this before, but just before we go into the details, I'm just going to, in answer first form, tell you the most desirable option from the school standpoint by far and away is to maintain the status quo organization. However, as I mentioned, this does assume that the HDC does approve an additional 2-year extension to the modulars of the Batchelder. And let's talk about what all that means and what the pros and cons are. But slides 10 through 13 are detailed 1-page descriptions of what would have to happen under each of these different scenarios. So option 1 is the status quo, and let me just sort of highlight some things to you. The organization and the enrollment would be the same way it is today, in that the Batchelder would no longer have kindergarten, but still have 4 sections of grade 1 through 5, and then the Hood and the Little would be as stated there. What's required in order to make this work, because as we mentioned, we're going to need 3 additional classrooms on top of what we have today, is the fact that not only would this assume maintaining the 2 modular units at the Batchelder, again filled with classrooms, but also adding 2 modular units at the Hood School site. The capital cost for this, the net to the town, is $200,000. The gross cost is about $400,000 because it's 2 units. However, there's remaining money in the amount of roughly $200,000 from the previous modular appropriation. There is an impact to the operational cost, again relative to today, and that's primarily around adding a new bus line, because maintaining the current organization is really going to dictate you need to add another bus line in order to alleviate some of those big issues that we have this year with the kindergartners and the other folks being bused around the town. So that's an impact relative to today, and then additional utility costs for heat and electricity and so forth at those 2 additional modulars at the Hood, again relative to today. So that's an annual cost of $50,000. This is the most benign scenario. It's easiest to implement because there's no additional restructuring that has to happen. The disadvantages are primarily around the fact that it actually doesn't do anything to help reclaim some of the space that's been taken at the Batchelder, because literally every space is still taken up by classrooms. So that's option 1.
Before you shift the page, just a quick question. It's not strictly in our purview, but it actually does seem appropriate to me. If an advantage is to not create additional stress on the Hood and Little, and a disadvantage is to, and I'll paraphrase it, to continue stressing the heck out of the batch, I find it a little disconcerting that keeping all of the core stresses on the batch is net considered an advantage.
You mean a disadvantage?
No, I think it's actually considered an advantage if this is the preferred plan.
Actually, it's not at all. Keeping the stresses on the batch is an issue, and it's something that the committee spent a lot of time talking about, particularly with the principal at the batch, about is this something from an educational standpoint that the school can live with. And this is still a disadvantage, absolutely, and that's why it's there.
Now, this reflects the leap that's already built in based on what we did this year.
Mm-hmm.
So the kindergarten
Oh, that's
is
true.
on, and some of the state classes are gone, right? So there's already been some relief on the batch.
That's a good point. Okay.
I just add to that, it also, option 1 does require 4 new classrooms, modular classrooms, 2 units, on the Hood School. And so you have an additional, because of the increasing enrollment.
Do we know that that's where the, so do we know
No, that's
that
where
that's
they
where the
go.
enrollment's going to,
Absolutely.
so the batch and the Little, their growth is more
Well,
benign
we
than the
put
Hood?
85 children, additional children from the batch over at the Hood School. So that alone.
Right.
And in order to accommodate them there, we had to consolidate. We didn't have money, nor did we have the space. So we had to consolidate classrooms at the Hood, which drove 3rd and 4th grade classroom sizes to 26, 27 and higher.
Mm.
So that's clearly an impact on the Hood School. And at the Little School, we have brought together, and it's actually problematic, it's a major concern, with special education programs all focused on one school. These children, both at the preschool level as well as grades 1, kindergarten through 5, are coming from the entire district. So there's a transportation issue, there's a traffic issue, and it's all focused on one school. You know, when we're in an age of inclusion in terms of special education, that actually flies in the face of it. So this plan, the status quo, in my judgment, is not viewed as an ideal educational issue, and I believe that all 3 of our schools, elementary schools, are taxed under this particular plan. As we'll see, the others, the impact on the other options, the impact actually becomes greater, and in some cases does more heavily influence the Hood School and the little school.
Absolutely. And the only thing I would add is that the group, in fact, Carol ran demographics by grade, by school, sort of going through every year, and the growth in the next 3 to 4 years is at the Hood. And that's where the demand and the stress is going to be incremental to today, the most significant.
Out of curiosity, and this is kind of bouncing into a discussion that we're not even going to have tonight because that board isn't here, I always assumed that, oh, actually, and this may be because of where you move things around. If we put everything back in place, as it were, is the growth in town still in what is currently the Batch District? If we were to put everything back where it belongs?
I believe the answer to that is yes. However, more recent data from the Elementary School Building Committee, and that committee has been working with the town planners, is indicating that we may need to be looking also at the Hood School. And I believe that, again, the addition of these modular classes may have a long-term, may help in that growth at the Hood School as well.
Okay.
Good. Let me contrast this with option 2, because this is probably the most important one for this group to look at, which is, let's assume the 2 modular units need to be removed from the batch elder. That's a net loss of 4 classrooms from the batch. The logical, let me just step through the logic of how this came up with. If you lose 4 classrooms, what you've essentially got to do is you've got to redistrict an entire section from 1 to 5. That's 5 classrooms actually, not 4, but that's the only sensible way educationally to do it. You can't just send 3 or 4 sections of something. So what we would be forced to do is to redraw the district lines and redistrict an entire section of students, in this case to the little school and not to the Hood School. The reason for that is that it's just it's not possible and it's unpalatable for the Hood School to become a 5 classroom per grade school. It's already a 4 classroom per grade school. It would be under the status quo. So the one section will be redistricted over to the little. Now the little, because the physical site cannot take additional modulars more than the one that's going in this year, the kindergartners and 1 special ed program that are currently at the little would need to be redistricted over to the Hood School site in the form of additional modular classrooms. So that's the way educationally this thing came out. So what this comes up to is centralized kindergarten at the Hood School site, likely in a cluster of modular trailers all connected, although clearly the site work would be complicated and we don't know all the answers here, but it would certainly be at the Hood School site. And then a redrawing of lines from the batch over to the little. So that's what would be required to make this happen. Now what happens? We'd be moving the 2 modulars. And as you'll see from the cost below, it's actually not trivial to physically move modulars. It's about $100,000 a modular to actually move and recite. So it's half the cost of buying a new one. Plus we would be buying 2 additional modulars at the Hood for the kindergarten and refurbish the first 2 that we'd be moving. And so there was to be a total of 4 modulars at the Hood School site. What would have to happen, and let me just jump down to the capital cost here. This would be a significantly more expensive capital investment for the town. In contrast to the $200,000 net cost under the status quo, we'd be talking about $600,000. It's $400,000 for the purchasing the 2 additional modulars, plus it would be $200,000 to move and refurbish the 2 existing batch elder modulars. That gets us to 6. Plus, in order to site 2 additional modulars at the Hood, and we have the copy of a modular study that's been done by an engineering consultancy, they would have to be sited in a way that would require much more significant site improvement, septic and plumbing work relative to just putting 2 there. So the incremental 2 modulars or 4 at the Hood School site would trigger a significant site improvement cost. The best estimate here is $200,000 incremental. And certainly we can take questions as to what would have to happen, but it's roads being moved and so forth. And I'm actually not the one that knows all the details on that. I'd have to defer.
Excuse me, but was consideration made for when and if? We don't know.